Good morning, Antioch. Welcome back to another daily devotional. We are in the Sermon on the Mount this week. And so remember, my challenge to you is this. Read Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7 with us throughout this week. And if you are a super overachiever, why don't you read the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, 6, and 7 every day this week? You won't regret it. It should take you, if you read the whole thing every day, about 15 minutes. So we're not saying, it's going to take you 3 hours every day to make it through this. This is totally worth it, and you will not be disappointed if you invest that time every day this week. So remember, we're looking at the big picture of the Sermon on the Mount, and so we're going to jump in where we left off in Matthew chapter 5, verse 13. Jesus says that we are the salt of the earth and the light of the world. And notice he doesn't say that we should be those things. He says that we are those things. See, as Jesus followers, we are the light of the world. We kind of can understand that one. But he says that we are the salt of the earth. We preserve it. We give it flavor. We did a sermon series a while back called A World Without Jesus, and I would highly recommend that you go back and take a look at that, because what we talk about in that series and what we explore is the question, what would our world look like if Jesus never existed? It is fascinating. What we discover is that our world has been so radically changed by Jesus Christ. Our culture has been so radically changed by Jesus Christ. Even people that don't acknowledge that he is who he claims to be, they are so radically changed by what Jesus taught that we would not recognize a world without Jesus. Spoiler alert, we wouldn't have hospitals, we wouldn't have modern education, we wouldn't even have science as we know it. It's a fascinating series. So go to YouTube and search our church and find A World Without Jesus. There's a whole playlist of sermons. Let me tell you, it's going to be worth it if you check those out. But what that is it's what he's talking about here. It's like, look, we are the salt of the earth. We are the light of the world. We change the world by who we are. And who we are people saved by Christ. Then he continues and he says, like in verse 17, he says, look, don't think that I have come to abolish the law. There were people that were thinking that he was trying to get rid of the law of Moses, and that's not what he's doing. What he continues through the rest of the chapter talking about is, he says, look, I'm not coming to get rid of the law of Moses. I am taking the law of Moses even deeper. And so he will say something that is written in the Old Testament law, and then he takes it deeper down to heart level. He's going to take something that's an outside superficial thing, and he's going to take it and say, let's look at it at the heart level. And so the first thing that he says is, he says, you've heard, do not murder. But then he says, I tell you, don't even be angry and hold grudges in your heart. He's saying that, look, just because you don't physically commit an act doesn't mean that everything is not all right on the inside. That we have got to be people who let go of grudges, that don't hold anger or hate toward other people, that we should be people of love. Then he continues, you've heard, don't commit adultery. He says, look, I tell you, don't even commit adultery in your heart by lusting. And then he says, you've heard it said, don't divorce your wife. He's saying, look, I'm telling you not to throw relationships away, because anytime you throw a relationship away, there is so much hurt and pain that comes from it. It is not what you want to do. Then he says, you've heard it said, don't break your oath. He says, look, let me tell you, here's what that means. It means be honest. Let your yes be yes, your no be no, not trying to be all complicated and convoluted. Just be a simple, honest person. Then he says, you've heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And this was never, even in the Old Testament, this was understood as a figurative thing. It wasn't a thing that you would, poke somebody in the eye if they poked you in the eye. This was actually a way for them to set up legally for people being compensated for loss. So if you lost this much, then you would sue and you would get this much back. And so he's saying, look, you've heard it like this. He said, but let me tell you, you just need to love people. If people try to take advantage of you, love them anyway. He's not saying you should try to be taken advantage of. No. That's not what he's saying. But he is saying that you should love people. And that's how he continues, because he says, you've heard it said, love your neighbor, hate your enemy. And the interesting thing here is love your neighbor is in the Old Testament, But the hate your enemy part was actually not in the Old Testament. That was just something that people added over the years as kind of like a traditional saying. They would say, well, we should love our enemy. I'm sure we should love our neighbor, which was a quote from the Old Testament, but hate our enemies. And they were like, yeah. No, he's saying, look, you've got to love everyone. Matter of fact, in verse 47, it says it pretty plainly. It says, if you greet only your brothers and sisters, what are you doing out of the ordinary? What's different about you? Don't even unbelievers do the same? What he's telling us is this: if we are people of love, then we should love people. He's saying that our love should not be conditional. We shouldn't say, I will love them when they love me. We should say, I will love them first. And where does this all go back to? It goes back to how God has loved us. God doesn't love us conditionally. God doesn't say, you love me and then I will love you. He says, look, I love you first regardless of whether you reciprocate. He's saying, I want you to love like I love. I want you to be the salt and the light. And to go back to verse 16, I love this. He gives the why on all of this. Why do we do all this? Why do we love? Why do we truly worship with our heart? Why do we do all of these things? He says, so that people may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven. That is what we are called to do, to lead people to follow Christ in a life-changing way by the very way that we live. So that was Matthew chapter 5. Tomorrow we'll be in Matthew chapter 6. I want you to follow along with us and be with us tomorrow morning at 10:30. See you then.